excited to be here and really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. Um, Partly because I think there's just a lot of opportunity in your Sage capacity team to really benefit from RAP. And so my role as outreach coordinator is to facilitate that. And so I very much see this as the beginning of a conversation and a partnership and something that we can continue going forward. So with that, I'll jump right into it. I should also recognize our partners at NRCS, BLM, and in the general Working Lands for Wildlife program. So at the highest level, I just want to start by defining what is RAP. And so there are really two key components. And the first is the spatial vegetation data. And so we have a variety of products that are available. And that'll be really the meat of what we'll be talking about today. But importantly, these data sets are really large and would be really cumbersome for any individual to try to deal with or analyze. And so to facilitate your ability to just analyze these data easily, there's a web application at rangelands.app that that we'll be exploring a lot today that can help you dive into these maps for your regions of interest. And so why would folks like you want to use RAP? Well, you work at a huge spatial extent across the Intermountain West. This is a very large and diverse region. And having some information about the types of vegetation across that region is really valuable. And yet there aren't a lot of great ways to do that. And so a product like RAP that covers the entire Western US can give you information about vegetation on the ground across different management boundaries and continuously across the regions that you work. And it's able to do this not just for 1 year, but for every year since 1984. So not only can you evaluate vegetation across your region today, you can look back in time and have a good idea about what types of changes have occurred over the past 36 years or so. And so that begs the question, what kind of data are we talking about here? So I want to introduce the data products that are available. And there are two primary data products. And I'm going to start by discussing the vegetation cover data set. And so the vegetation cover data set has 5 vegetation classes: perennial herbaceous, annual herbaceous, shrubs, trees, and bare ground. And these are really useful in a variety of ways. They're fairly coarse, but especially in the Intermountain West, where annual invasives are an important issue, and conifer change is an important issue. There are a variety of ways that you can use these data sets. And as I mentioned, they're not just available for one point in time, but for every year for the past, since 1984. And an important detail is that the spatial resolution, meaning that kind of the size of the pixels that comprise the image. So when you zoom in on these images, eventually you'll see that they're comprised of pixels, and each pixel is a 30-meter spatial resolution, which is roughly the size of the infield of a baseball diamond. And I really want to give some background on how this data set is produced, especially for you all, because, well, I think it's useful for you to have some understanding, but also because data that you might have collected goes right into this model. And so there are 2 primary data sets used as inputs into the model. And the first is field vegetation data. And this comes from the NRCS NRI dataset and the BLM AIM dataset. And so this is really, the product of a lot of effort on behalf of these agencies. And a data set like RAP really couldn't exist without the field data that that you all have contributed to or may have contributed to. So if you've helped with AIM or NRI programs, we certainly really appreciate your contribution to this data set and hope that you'll benefit a lot from it and see this as a fruit of your labor. And then the other important data input is satellite data from the Landsat program. And so Landsat is a joint program between the US Geological Survey and NASA. And it's incredibly valuable because it does go back in terms of its comparable period all the way to 1984. So that's what gives us the ability to produce data sets from 1984 through present day. And that's also what determines the spatial resolution of 30 meters for our products. Landsat is also a 30-meter data set. There's a lot I could say about Landsat, but that will be for another forum. And so these are both very large data sets. And so we rely on, for producing the models, cloud computing from our partners at Google, specifically Google Earth Engine. And so using that cloud computing, we're able to use machine learning models to find relationships between the satellite data and the field vegetation data, and to ultimately produce the maps that you see on the RAP. And so there's certainly more I could say about this model, but and we'll have opportunity for questions. But the next model that I want to introduce is the Rangeland production data set. And so with this data set, we're mapping herbaceous biomass production on for two vegetation classes. So broken out into perennial herbaceous plants and annual herbaceous plants. And it's measuring this in terms of pounds per acre. And so these data, like the vegetation cover data set, are available annually. So you can evaluate change over the period of a number of years, whether biomass production has increased or decreased year over year for a given location. But an important distinction is that you're also able to evaluate vegetation production every 16 days. So you can look at previous years and within a given year, evaluate when production peaked, how much production occurred at different times of the year. And in fact, even in almost real time, you can evaluate how much production is occurring for this current year, 2021. So you're able to, there was just the most recent estimate just came online 5 days ago on May 8th, and you can go online for any area you might be interested in the range of RAP and get an estimate for how much production occurred across whatever pasture or allotment or region you're interested in. These data are available from 1986 to present. And again, they're available at a 30-meter spatial resolution. And so just a little bit of background on this model as well. This one's a little bit different from the vegetation cover model. The vegetation cover data set is based on relationships between field data and satellite data. In this data set, we're actually modeling the process of herbaceous biomass production. And so if you think of what it takes to produce vegetation biomass, of course, different types of vegetation are going to be important. And so we're actually able to use the vegetation cover data set to tease out how much production is coming from different vegetation types. And then absorbed solar radiation is fundamental for photosynthesis. And so using satellite data to measure that. And as you'd expect, moisture is important for plants to be able to produce biomass, and temperature as well. So this is a very detailed model, but this hopefully gives some kind of understanding for just some of the data inputs that go into it. And I'd have to refer to the scientific papers for the technical details. And this is a 50-year-old model that's been used in ecology for estimating biomass production. But one of the big leaps forward here is that ability to use vegetation cover. And, you know, all of you, or I don't have to tell you that vegetation communities across the Western US are complex. This is an example from Northern Wyoming. You can see a variety of different vegetation types interacting. Previous versions of this model used just categorical data to estimate vegetation type. And so any given location was classified purely as a forest or a grassland or a shrubland. Because of the vegetation cover data set, we're able to have a much more kind of nuanced picture, much more nuanced data input for this model that describes a lot more how these different vegetation classes are interacting on the ground. And so those are the two primary data sets within RAP. Additionally, and we'll be talking about these in a variety of different ways going forward. So additionally, we have some supporting data sets available as well. So we'll see all of this within the app during the demonstration shortly. But in general, within the app, we have two tabs for sagebrush conservation and Great Plains conservation. And each of these tabs are intended to have data layers that can support kind of your understanding of the context of the different areas you're looking for. And so some of the layers we have available are an annual herbaceous cover layer, which I'll talk about a little bit later in a little bit more detail. This map of ecosystem resilience and resistance, categorical tree cover, sage grouse priority areas, which you can see in kind of the red outlines on the screen here, and sagebrush biome extent. So these layers, you can look at these as you're working with the data in RAP and have some understanding of the types of landscape context you're looking at. And similarly for the Great Plains, we have a categorical tree cover data set, a data set depicting woody transitions. And so this is showing areas where conifer trees have expanded over the period of RAP. A cultivation risk layer, which shows where potential for land use conversion from perennial rangelands to agriculture exists. And then the Great Plains biome extent. And so I won't go into any more detail on these because I really want to focus on the vegetation cover or on the vegetation data available within RAP, but it's helpful to know that these exist and have them in your back pocket as you're using RAP. And so one of the things that I really think is cool about RAP is that, it's these two primary data sets and, we're adding more down the road, but there's a real elegance to the simplicity of them in that you can use them to derive a lot of insight into the landscapes that you're working on. And so I want to kind of tease that out a little bit, just what makes RAP unique in this way. And one important aspect is the ability to use RAP to understand landscape variability. So what do I mean by that? So in the past, on your screen, you see maps and pie charts of two different pastures depicting annual herbaceous vegetation. You can think of this as essentially a cheatgrass or invasive annual grass layer in this context. And on its face, you might look at the two numbers depicted at the top and say, well, they both have about 25% average cover across these pastures. But using a data set like RAP, you're able to see that, well, in reality, pasture one has a much more kind of uniform or homogeneous distribution of annual herbaceous cover density, with kind of these moderate annual herbaceous densities. Whereas in pasture 2, there are areas within that pasture that have almost no annual herbaceous cover, and other areas that have upwards of 40% or more. And so this is going to have significant implications for how you might manage this landscape. And so having this perspective of landscape variability is really valuable. Another important aspect of RAP is the ability to look at change through time. And so in this slide, you can see two examples from 2002 and 2010 for the same location. And in each example, whether you're looking at the chart or the maps or the photos, you can see that, that there's much lower perennial herbaceous cover in 2002 compared to 2010. And the opposite is true for bare ground, where bare ground is decreasing between 2002 and 2010. And for this location, there were photos available, but for a lot of locations that you might be working, you're not going to necessarily have the photos or the data that you'd need. And so you can use RAP alongside whatever other data you have to inform your perspective of how the landscapes you're working on might have changed. And so it's just another tool in your toolbox as you're trying to piece together what might have happened on a certain landscape and how that influences how you might implement management or conservation in those areas. Similarly, because of the ability to look at change through time, you can use RAP in the context of adaptive management. So this is an example from a fire that burned in 2015, straddling the Oregon and Idaho border. And you can see that across that state line, that there are some significant differences in annual herbaceous cover. And so, these species don't conform to state boundaries. Obviously, there was some sort of management that was applied here across this state boundary. And so this map is from 2018, and so you can then, and we'll explore some examples of this, of how you can, for a given location, look at how things have changed. But you can see that following that fire in 2015, these locations have had significantly different trajectories. And so you might try to replicate the type of management that has been applied on the Oregon side, or apply that type of management on the Idaho side if that's possible. Regardless, you can use it as just another piece of information within an adaptive management framework, and hopefully alongside some local field data as well. And the final kind of example that has really just clicked for me recently, I mentioned I'm new in my position, but I think that it's, could be really useful for all of you, is the ability to use RAP to inform spatial strategies generally. And so in this slide is an example that's been put forward by the USDA NRCS around this, this strategy of defend the core, grow the core, and mitigate impacts. So what does that mean? Well, here in this kind of conceptual map, you can see the intact kind of core areas that you'd imagine would be kind of these, sagebrush shrublands or other types of shrublands. And then a range of different levels of annual herbaceous invasion, invasive annual grass invasion, all the way through these highly invaded locations. And so radiating out from those core areas, you can see, these arrows depicting where you would maybe want to try to grow those core areas, especially in the context of disturbance like fire And those are both opportunities and, places where you would want to prevent cheatgrass, in this case, from gaining a foothold. And so one of the groups that has really implemented this is the NRCS in Idaho, which has actually taken this strategy and applied it to real cheatgrass data from RAP. And so here you can see over the Snake River Plain where that group, which has put forward this effort called the Cheatgrass Challenge, has identified core areas, has depicted areas where they're trying to grow those core areas with the dotted lines and the arrows, and then has also denoted this annual grass region. So strategies like this can help to frame expectations in terms of what's possible and also create a common frame of reference across a variety of different stakeholders. And so what might this look like on the ground, bringing this out of the abstract maps and into how we usually see these landscapes? Well, in those core areas, where there's intact sagebrush and deep-rooted bunch grasses or whatever the native vegetation type is there, it might be early detection and rapid response type approaches with spot treatments of small infestations. But usually these areas aren't going to need a ton of management attention. And then in those transition areas, that might be the area, especially after fire, where more of that management effort in terms of restoration, emergency stabilization might occur to prevent those annual grasses from gaining a foothold and to possibly even expand that core area. And then being, really just frankly, somewhat realistic about what might be possible in the short term in the annual grass dominated areas. And so here it's more about that mitigate impacts piece, at least in the short term. So, things like fire breaks or targeted grazing might be appropriate. And so maps like RAP can get a diverse group of stakeholders on the same page for formulating together these collaborative spatial strategies. And so I'm now going to kind of turn our attention in the direction of a demo after this. It's hopefully a lot of kind of useful information that can frame that demonstration. But I really like these guiding principles, which Brady Allred, who's the RAP is really his brainchild, has put forward these guiding principles along with his colleagues in a forthcoming manuscript for kind of how to use satellite-derived maps like RAP in the context of rangeland management and monitoring. And so the first one is to use maps within a decision-making framework. And so you don't want to use these maps in isolation. These maps will not make decisions for you. They'll help you to have maybe a fuller picture of the context in which you're making decisions. But you always want to anchor that to whatever other information you have and to be thoughtful about how you're using these maps in the context of the types of actions you're considering putting on the ground. And then we've talked about, these maps are really useful for understanding and embracing landscape variability, for having that perspective of just, an entire landscape that can be hard to comprehend or think about without some sort of kind of abstraction like this in the form of maps. This keep error in perspective is a really important one and also a tricky one. You want to keep in mind that these maps are estimates. They're not going to be perfect measurements of rangeland condition. And yet, any of the measurements, all of you may have gone out and collected data and know that, any field collection effort has its own set of kind of error types and limitations. And so all of our products are peer reviewed and quantify error in some way. And so I encourage you to check that out because it can help your thinking. but also not to dwell on the error that's inherent in them too much, or to cause that to erode confidence in the usefulness of these products. And finally, as you're using the data, you'll likely encounter areas where the wrap data will contradict with some expectation or piece of knowledge or understanding you have about a landscape. And that can be a good opportunity to take a step back, think about, is the data wrong, or is it pointing out something that I hadn't recognized or hadn't thought of in a particular way about my landscape that I'm interested in. So taking that step back and not just throwing out the data, but thinking about it in terms of what might be occurring on the landscape. And so with that, I think that's hopefully some useful information to lead us into a demo of the app. So I'm going to open up my browser and go over to rangelands.app. Usually people caution against doing live demos, and I love that I can go into the wrap and just never have issues with it. So we'll see if I hopefully haven't jinxed us today. But before I jump into the app, I do want to point out we've just published a support site. So while we're here, I'll just point this out, that as you start to use the wrap and kind of poke around, this can be a kind of useful reference for different types of documentation that can, you can get any questions that come up later answered here. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but just wanted to point out that you can always click this support button, and that will take you to that site. And for now, I'm going to launch right into the app with this big launch app button. And I'm not going to go through the tour because I'll hopefully do that effectively. So when you open things up, it's going to be an interface that'll look a lot like Google Maps, and that's because it's actually built on Google's system. And so you'll have this big interactive map in the middle of your screen. And then you have this dashboard in your top left of your screen with, so this is the map layers panel. And at the top of this, you'll notice that there are 3 tabs, one for vegetation, another for sagebrush conservation, and another for Great Plains conservation. And so you'll remember that the sagebrush and Great Plains conservation are the supplementary layers that I mentioned earlier that are there available for you as you're using wrap. So here I'm going to focus almost exclusively on the vegetation tab, because that's kind of comprises most of what we think of as wrap. And so within this tab, at the top, these top 2 kind of rows, you'll see, well, here's our vegetation cover data, and here's the herbaceous biomass data. You can just toggle them off with these switches. And then starting with the vegetation cover data set, you can use this drop down to control the particular vegetation cover type that you're seeing on the map. And so right now we're seeing annual herbaceous cover for the year 2020. But of course, you can look back in time using this next drop down menu. So maybe we're interested in seeing what annual herbaceous cover was in 1990. And you can see a comparison and see some pretty significant changes over that period of time. I'll also point out that you can change the base map here. So right now it's showing just a kind of default Google style map, but you can turn on satellite imagery as well. And then you can use this slider in order to alter the transparency of the data. And so then that can, allow you to see the satellite imagery underneath. And so then that's the vegetation cover data set. And then similarly, for the herbaceous biomass data set, you can have this drop down that you can control the vegetation type you're seeing. And so you can see annual herbaceous and perennial herbaceous. I didn't mention this, but just kind of quote unquote herbaceous layer is just adding together the perennial and annual, recognizing that that is just total herbaceous production. And then similar situation, you can use this drop-down menu to change the year and go back to 1990 or 2000 and look at change through time. And so it can be, really informative to just explore through all these different years for these different data types. You might have noticed that there are kind of some holes as it appears in the data, and that's as a result of this switch. And so by default, we have turned on to exclude croplands development and water, and that's because our models really weren't designed or trained to work in those land cover types. And so if you do decide to evaluate those land cover types, just apply a little bit more scrutiny or thoughtful interpretation as you're using them. And so, like I said, there's a lot of utility to kind of exploring around these different layers. A lot of times we just want to be able to see what trends have occurred for a given allotment or pasture or whatever type of land we might be working in. And so we have built in 3 different ways that you can load in your region of interest. And so you can upload a shapefile. You just need to zip up a shapefile, and I'll show that in a moment. You can also just interactively draw a feature on the screen, and I'll demonstrate that. And then the third one is that I believe it's above 1,000 acres between 1984 and 2017. And so you're able then to evaluate that change through time for those areas. So I'll start by showing you how to load in a shapefile. So you'll just click this upload shapefile button. And then I have a zip shapefile here that I'm just going to click on that zip shapefile, click open, and it zips right to it. If you have kind of multiple features within your shapefile, whether those are points or lines or polygons, it'll show all of those on the screen. And then to see change through time averaged over that polygon or whatever type of feature it is, you just click on the feature itself and a pop-up will pop up and you have the option to calculate time series. It usually won't run quite as fast as it did just now. I've run it a number of times for this polygon, so but it's quite fast usually. And once it runs, you'll have now this new tab open for evaluating analysis through time over your polygon. So this can be somewhat small, so I'm going to expand it out. And you'll see that, well, these plots are very interactive. They give you data as you scroll over them, tell you, in 2007, there was an estimate of around 52% perennial forbin grass for this area. But these can be a lot of information on a plot. So you can turn off just by clicking on the legend item, turn off any ones that you might not be interested in seeing. Or if you're just interested in, say, perennial forbs and grasses, you can double click and it'll show only that one layer. And so this reach of this river, this polygon, is in Central Oregon and had a restoration project applied to it in 2004. And it's just such a cool example because following 2004, you can see some pretty significant changes. And so this is the vegetation cover plot, but we really see those changes carry over in terms of the annual biomass plot. And so when I expand that, and let's just look at the total herbaceous biomass, you can see that following 2004, there's just this huge increase in production across this river valley bottom. And so a lot of insight that you can gain here in this case in the context of a river restoration project. And then the last plot that's available is this 16-day biomass plot. And you can see that the most recent estimates came online just 5 days ago. And you can compare 2021 to any other year that you might be interested in and see how things are shaping up relative to those years. And so another estimate will come online here in another 16 days or so, a little bit less now, I guess. So that's generally how you analyze a region of interest. I showed you just for a shapefile, but I want to go to another example to show you how to draw a feature on your map. And so for this, I'm going to go to Southern Oregon, outside of Adel, Oregon. And this is going to be a tree cover example, an area where there was a tree removal project that occurred in 2016. And so, I always need this to be able to find the specific area. So this is really useful if you're just exploring around, or just if you don't have a shapefile for a given area. So I'm interested in this area right through here, where we can see in 2010 compared to 2020, those trees have been removed. And so I'm going to draw a feature around this. And so you just click the draw features button, and then you can kind of just interactively draw right on the map. And I don't know if I'm doing a very precise job, but you can do that. And then let's see. And then the analysis already ran. It didn't quite show it in the same way because this was reduced, but when I open this up, let's say we just want to look at tree cover, and we can see that sure enough, shortly after 2016, tree cover diminished to almost nothing. And then, maybe we're interested in, well, what's the response been in terms of the herbaceous communities? And we can see that well, following 2016, there's been an increase overall in herbaceous production, but there's also been this increase in annual herbaceous production that, that's an important piece of information as well, and something that, might be able to get you to go check that out and see if there's something going on the landscape in that area. An interesting piece with this, you may have noticed that that the satellite data actually show trees in this area. And so I had to I was kind of like, well, what's going on there? And went into Google Earth and found that actually this satellite data is out of date and is from 2016 for this area. And so it's just not even reflecting the changes on the ground that we can actually see within RAP. So hopefully they'll update that soon, because it's a few years out of date, obviously, at this point. And so the last example that I want to show you in here is how you can analyze a fire boundary. And I found one that I thought was pretty cool. And we'll leave Oregon for this example. We'll go to the Utah-Idaho border. This is the area, kind of the south side of City of Rocks. I think it's a national preserve, big kind of climbing area. And this burned in 2000. It's called the City of Rocks Fire. So I kind of skipped over this. I should have said what I was doing. So I turned on, there's a feature to display fire boundaries, and you just use this same switch, just like we've seen to this point. And then you can look at any fire boundaries, 1984 to 2017. And when you load those up, not only can you see where those fires burned, but you can actually click on those areas and analyze them totally on the fly. So I think I need to reload that. And so when I do that for this area, it's pretty interesting. We can see that this fire, which burned in 2000, well, let's see what happened in terms of tree cover. We can see that tree cover went way down after this fire and really hasn't rebounded a whole lot. And bare ground went up a lot initially, but since then, perennial forbs have started to fill in, is what the RAP is kind of depicting here in terms of change. And we can see kind of the same pattern in terms of biomass production going up following fire in this map in that period after the year 2000 here. And if you want a little more kind of confidence that that's occurring, we can kind of zoom in and just look at where the RAP is depicting tree cover for 2020, and it's matching up pretty closely compared with if we go back to 1998, and it's depicting a much different picture with much more expansive tree cover over this area. And so again, you don't want to use this information in isolation. I don't actually know a whole lot about this area, but seeing some of those patterns gives me confidence that it's saying something about, that's occurring on the landscape. So that's basically what I wanted to show in terms of this demo. It's kind of been, a little bit of a whirlwind tour, but hopefully you've seen how you can use these kind of glean insights for your regions of interest in the RAP. The last thing that I will highlight is that, say you want to, just have the data for your region of interest, or let's say, you want to visualize the data in some different way. You can download for any of the either the annual cover, the annual biomass, or the 16-day biomass. You can download spreadsheets of any of those. So then, I can just open this up, and you'll see 37 years of data, 36 years of data for all of the vegetation types, and you can use that however you'd like, or just kind of archive it for your records, or however you might want to use it, maybe in a report or something like that. So with that, I'm going to go back to my presentation to kind of close us out with some examples that are relevant. I'm going to see if, all right, just making sure there's not, all right, I think we're okay in the chat. So with that, I'm going to transition into some examples that that will, hopefully be relevant to all of you, focusing on these areas of conservation action, which Mandy pointed out to me, kind of delineating some of your priority resource issues you're focusing on. And so none of this is news to you, but conifer removal, wet meadow restoration, fire and invasives, outcome-based grazing, and big game migratory corridors. And so we've already, touched on these to some extent on a few of these, and we'll just kind of drive them home a little bit more. So in terms of conifer removal, how might you evaluate, conifer change and removal using the wrap? Well, we saw the one example of how you can use the wrap to kind of quantify success in terms of treatment. And this can just be another, chart that you can put into a report or something like that to depict what kind of change has occurred in addition to whatever other data or information you might have. Additionally, for areas that might not have been treated, you can evaluate what type of change has occurred in tree cover over the period of 35 years. So in this untreated polygon down here, there's been kind of this steady increase in conifer or just tree cover over that period. And so that can be a valuable piece of information for you. Another valuable data set is the categorical tree cover data set on the sagebrush conservation tab. And this is the same data as the vegetation cover data set, but it's just depicted with a nice color ramp that relates fairly closely to different phases of woodlands across the West, and has this nice color ramp that when you're looking at, maybe a regional scale map with your collaborators at different agencies or organizations, this can be a useful one to look at because those conifer areas just jump out at you, and you can look at it again for every year between 1984 and 2020. So just want to point that one out. It can be useful for kind of drawing out some of those different classes of woodland density. In terms of wet meadow restoration, this is one that I'm really kind of interested in. We saw the example in the demonstration of that large restoration project and being able to see that increase in production following that project. And so, I feel pretty confident this can work really well for evaluating change following restoration projects. Now, the types of restoration projects that you can see will just depend on the scale of the type of project you're doing. So, I'm really interested in whether in some instances you can see some of these small scale restorations like sea dike structures or otherwise. And as you're exploring this, that's something I'd be really interested to hear from you all, whether you're able to see that. You may just not be able to, because keep in mind pixels here are 30 by 30 meter areas. Sometimes those areas that are affected just might be smaller than that pixel size to the extent that they don't really show up. And of course, that doesn't mean, those projects can be really valuable and they just might not show up in this particular data set. So anyways, I encourage you to kind of explore that. And so going back to the same example, and we really already kind of looked at this in some detail, but following that restoration project in 2004, there's just this huge kind of increase in production for that area. One other data set that might be of interest here is a music resources data set that was produced by the Sage Grouse Initiative. A lot of overlap with the people who have brought forth the RAP. But this is showing extent and availability of music resources across Sage Grouse Range for every year up through 2017. So that's the only thing, is it hasn't been updated for the last few years, as far as I know, not on the website anyways. So that's another one maybe worth exploring. Fire and invasives. Somehow I haven't talked about this a whole lot over the course of the presentation. I guess the cheatgrass challenge example was a pretty impactful one, but this is a really important use of the wrap. And so there are, being able to use those fire polygons that are loaded into the wrap, those fire perimeters, you can use the herbaceous production data set to evaluate um, annual herbaceous cover as kind of a proxy for fine fuels uh, on a year-to-year basis, and then also as using that near real-time data. And so that near real-time data in this context can give you some information about whether this is shaping up to be a big cheatgrass year or not. And then there's a strong relationship often between cheatgrass production and these kind of probability of fire. And so that's can be kind of an early warning sign in some cases, something to be aware of. And yeah, you can see in this example, following a fire in 2006, there was really kind of a big increase in especially cheatgrass cover, but herbaceous production overall. And with cheatgrass, we often see in the RAP data these high annual variability. And that's something that just bears out on the ground as well. The vegetation cover data set can be really useful in this context too, especially for kind of evaluating shifts in dominance in different types of vegetation. So in this example, you can see shrubs depicted in blue and annual forbs and grasses depicted in red. And following that fire, you see these diminished kind of shrubland estimates and increased annual forb and grass cover. And there appears to be kind of a shift in dominance over the large area of this fire. And so you can use that to get a sense of, well, are native shrubs, still holding the upper hand over the course of these large fires, or are annuals starting to gain a foothold? And finally, we have published an annual herbaceous cover map. And this one is a little bit different from the annual herbaceous vegetation cover in that it actually synthesizes three different products. And so it's also an average of a period from 2016 to 2018. And so this is on the sagebrush conservation tab, but can be another pretty useful one, and also has been used in this Western Governors Association toolkit for invasive annual grass management. So it might be one that folks you're working with might be more familiar with, just because it's been used in a variety of different contexts. All right, we've got a couple more. So outcome-based grazing, and here it's all about the herbaceous production data set. And you can cut this up a couple of different ways in terms of evaluating change in the annual data. And to me, it's just thinking about, is production increasing or decreasing over time? And is annual versus perennial kind of that relationships between annuals and perennials changing? And that can just be another piece of information to evaluate kind of long-term trajectories in relation to grazing pastures or allotments. And then of course, here you can also use the 16-day data to get an idea whether this is going to be a really productive year in terms of whatever area of interest you're focused on. And that might affect, the decisions you're making in near real time. And, of course, producers are out in their, are out in the field, knowing these landscapes, but oftentimes these landscapes are large. And so a data set like RAP can be useful for those areas that are just harder to get to as well. And finally, in terms of this big game migratory corridors piece, this is one that the connection isn't quite as immediately obvious, but I think there's a lot of potential for using the vegetation cover data set in this context. And so, whether or not you have capacity locally in the context of this issue to produce some sort of movement-based model or something like that, um, oftentimes as an input into those models, they rely on some sort of vegetation cover or land cover type data. And oftentimes it's just using categorical data that again just classifies locations as shrubs or uh, trees or grassland. With RAP, you know, you can get a much more kind of nuanced perspective of the landscape uh, that these species are observing as they're out on the landscape. And so an example of using this just came out from Tori Donovan at University of Nebraska Lincoln, using the vegetation cover data set to model habitat use by bighorn sheep in Wyoming. And in all of her models, the RAP vegetation cover was in every one of her models because it was just came out as a very important variable. So you know, this is going to be something that maybe you're not going to go out and use RAP for this purpose tomorrow, but keep it in your back pocket as something that if there's local interest in doing something like this, and maybe you have some money to put something, some sort of research project forward, the capability to do something like this would exist. All right, I'm gonna have to kind of close through these pretty quickly. So I did want to just point out a couple of resources available to you as you're starting to use RAP. And I'll make these slides available so you can, I think Mandy or Tina will send them out to you all. But just recently, I didn't have any role in producing these, but I'm finding them incredibly useful. These frameworks for conservation action for the one that will be most relevant to you will be the sagebrush biome. And uh, this is a threat-based framework, and the threats really closely align with your priority areas. And what's nice about this website, wlfw.rangelands.app, is it will give you, it draws heavily on the RAP. And so you can refer to it for, well, how can I think about RAP data in the context of these resource issues that I'm trying to deal with? So I encourage you to check out that website. I mentioned the help site that we have available, and just to make this a place you can come back to as you're digging into the RAP if you have any questions. And you can contact, there are all these spots where you can contact us through this website. Those messages go directly to me and to one of our lead scientists, Matt Jones. And so we're able to address those questions often in short order. So if you're not finding what you need, you can contact us directly that way. And this is very much in development, but we will be in the coming, really next year or so, maybe somewhat shorter than that, be developing a more thorough RAP curriculum. This is a lot of information to pack in to a short period of time. And so having some more time to be able to explore more concepts in a more well-paced kind of manner is valuable. And so this will be developed primarily for BLM and NRCS audiences, as you know, they can put it into action immediately, but also with a variety of other audiences kind of in mind. And the goal here is really to just support implementation of RAP in management generally. And so we have a team of BLM and NRCS personnel helping to guide this process. And we're planning to deliver this in a variety of different ways. So that's not coming immediately down the pipe, but keep an eye and ear out for it down the road. And with that, I just want to thank you for your time and attention. I know it's, you know, there's a lot of information here and a lot to dig into. And yeah, I'm really excited to share with you all because I think you can really use it. So my contact information's here. The links are available. We'll have some time for questions shortly, but yeah, just don't hesitate to be in touch. So with that, I'll pass it back to Mandy.
So our next presenter is Connor White. Connor is in his, just approaching like a 1 year with the Sage Capacity team and our partners in the Sage Initiative. So he is based in Boise, Idaho. He is the Bruno Wahi Sage Grouse Habitat Project Coordinator. And before that, Connor worked for 5 years as a range specialist for the Sage Grouse Initiative out of Burley, Idaho. So Connor's gonna take us kind of like one step further and show us kind of on a landscape scale how they have been using RAP in particular for particular project areas, and just give us kind of a insight to how just an example of where they're using RAP within their area of work. So Connor, with that, I will hand it over to you.
Nice, thanks, Mandy. Yeah, I guess we're just gonna go through a few practical, I guess, just ways that we've kind of been using RAP. Mainly, Eric did a good job on having that his presentation be very well organized. So most of my three examples I'm going to use are going to be based on the Rangeland cover product. So just a short little overview of what I want to go over. I'm mainly going to do a deep dive into how we're using it on juniper cover and tying that to some project implementation. And then I have a few slides on annual grasses and just a little bit, something to think about, I guess, how Boise District is using RAP data sets with some wilderness monitoring. It's pretty cool stuff. But the photo in the background kind of does 2 for 1 for me. This is actually South Central Idaho. Shows you some juniper encroachment, and then in the foreground is actually the dividing line on a annual grass treatment area on the left, and no treatment. It was a different, we treated it the following year on the right. So we'll get into a little bit of some of that later. But I guess just to dive right in to a little bit about the juniper cover layers. Yeah, Eric did a great job on telling you guys what it, just general information about it, and just to call out a few of those relevant pieces of information. It's backed up by, you know, just the RAP in general, backed up by a lot of data. I know, Eric, you said that, you know, if you've ever collected data that was like, yeah, I was one of those people, but it was when it was half before it was AIM. So the only thing I can hope is that those 2 summers worth of data are somehow feeding the RAP machine right at this moment. But I would also like to just call out here on this graphic on the right that the error rate for trees is the lowest one, 2.8% mean absolute error, which is pretty dadgum good. I know on the previous version, there was cover 1.0. Cover 2.0 came out sometime last year, and it is quite a bit more accurate, we've found in the field. I know on that first version, you know, I wasn't really using it as much because it just wasn't as accurate on thicker trees. But we found that version 2.0 seems to do a better job. And a few other things that are worthy of calling out is just Jeremy Maestas made me realize this, that just, you know, if you're an agency or, you know, an organization and you want to do some high dollar mapping effort, you know, like this is going to be the effort. We're going to spend a lot of money, we're going to get a great product, and you probably will, but, you know, in a few years, it's going to be outdated. And that's, I think, is one of the real advantages to the RAP, is that you get these things update every year. And in, you know, a juniper system, it's not a static system. You know, it's going to be changed. It's going to be infilling. You're going to get new expansion, which is estimated to be about, you know, 0.5% a year. So that's, I guess, just in general, some of the advantages that you might get using a RAP data set as opposed to one that's stuck on one particular year. This slide, this is a fun little set of slides that I had to throw in. just to talk about scale, because I feel like it's always a relevant conversation topic in really any kind of rangeland applications. But we spend a lot of time looking at our feet, right? Like I said, I collected data way back in 2012, as a field technician, and you just line point intercept, what's going on right at this exact spot, which has value, but when you start thinking about things like an ecologist, a landscape ecologist, like what's going on in this photo, for instance. Let me see if I can turn on the pointer. You got some cool mountains back here. This is some cool stuff. You got sagebrush steppe, juniper encroachment. I bet sage grouse would live here. You start zooming in and you're like, all right, well, there's maybe some mining activity going on here. This looks maybe like a Utah juniper. Still a little tough to tell what kind of sagebrush you're dealing with. And you keep zooming in and you're like, okay, definitely mining activity going on. Definitely a Utah juniper. That looks like low sage and, some different bunch grasses there. But you get drilled in too far and then you're like, oh man, check out this. There's whole other things that are going on. So by the time that you zoom in to a scale that's not what you're going to be doing in management, you just kind of have derailed yourself essentially, or you spent unnecessary additional time to get to the same result. So I'm an archery elk hunter, so right here it's just like send it. I just happened to sneak up on this elk, so this was a fun little photo series using an elk to demonstrate some stuff about scale. So which, out of these two, which one are going to benefit sage grouse the most? The honest answer is probably both of them, but when you're talking about treatments, specifically, these large pervasive problems like annual grasses or conifer, the one on the left is definitely the way to be thinking about the landscape. And if you haven't seen this paper, you should go read it. This was a fascinating, thought-provoking paper that I guess, if you haven't seen it yet, go give it a read. It's will make you just think about how things have been done previously, and how that all ties in to where we're at right now. Anyway, so it's relevant to scale. The project that I work on is called the Bosch Project. It's a juniper removal project in Southwest Idaho. It is a 1.67 million acre project area. And within that, we can treat 617,000 acres, which is what's called the focal treatment area. So the 1.67 million is what was analyzed it was an EIS document, and then actual cutting would be able to occur within 617,000 acres. So it's mainly targeting phase 1 and 2 conifer encroachment. It's western juniper. State, this area, I guess the light yellow stuff over here on the map on the left is just BLM lands. But state and private lands are also, it's not included on this map, but they're working in conjunction with this project. So that's back to the all hands, all lands approach as part of Partners in the Sage. It's just not reflected on this map, but NRCS has invested heavily in the Bosch project area to the tune of, Owyhee County gets most of the sage grouse money each year. So that was kind of my role in this position, is just to make sure that we're all on the same page, that everyone's informed, and we're all working towards the same goal. Here's a fun little, I did a wrap run, where Eric uploaded a shape file. Well, I uploaded the whole focal treatment area. And apparently one of those deals is like one gigantic 500,000 acre, block. So I ran it on 500,000 acres within Bosch. So there's the run over here. You can see conifer levels are quite low, which is like, it's 1.1%, I think, for 2020, which is good, honestly. But you might be looking at this red line and going, Connor, what the heck are you cutting trees for? You're not addressing the right threat for this area. And that has validity, but I will get into that a little bit later. So just to tie it back to, I guess maybe even slightly before this slide, you got to have a NEPA document completed, and that takes time. So plan on that. In our instance, it took many years to get to where we're at now, where we have a completed signed document. But now, when you do have that, you have the ability to go in, do contracting. It's an imperfect process, no matter who's doing it, really. As the BLM puts out, quite a number of contracts for, besides just juniper removal, every year. So that's another part of my position, is since I'm hosted through Pheasants Forever, we have the ability to enter into memorandums of MOUs, agreements, cooperative agreements, and with those mechanisms, in instances where Pheasants Forever can do do work on BLM land, whether that's with BLM dollars or with outside partner dollars, such as NIFWIF. We're holding a large NIFWIF grant here as part of the Bosch project. But when you get towards the contracting end of things, you're really just kind of a guessing game, really. I say when dollars and details show up late, it just leads to this mad scramble in a time of year where everything has to go perfectly according to plan, otherwise it could just blow up right in your face. So this example here on the right, this was a contract I put out last year. It was the end of August before I even got it out, and then you're trying to tell these people to have it done in just a few short months. You're not really leaving yourself a lot of room for error. And the way we usually do it is just you have an area, like Worthington Springs. Here's how many acres it is. I want a price of dollars per acre, basically. And I say timing is everything, because it's usually worked out, but there's, like I say, not a lot of room for error on that stuff. So it all left me wondering, just like, there must be a better way, which when I got into this position here in Boise, I realized that the way that the government, when they put out a contract, they do government estimates just for their own purposes, to figure out how much it might cost, which is usually tied to what's called an IDIQ contract, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity. The one that they use here on this district is an old one from Oregon, just to even give us as the BLM an idea, hey, what might this cost to do this project that we want to do. So it all got me thinking. I was like, that's got to be based on something, and the honest answer is the BLM, what we're using now, was the old cover 1.0. Like, well, we now have a even more accurate way to spit out juniper canopy cover data, and that's through the RAP. So I'm putting out my own IDIQ contract through Pheasants Forever, and this is what it's going to look like. We've just binned it up into certain different canopy cover levels. And then based on, different years, it's a 5-year deal. And based on these specifications, I want a price for each one of these different canopy cover levels based on these specifications. And the way that'll end up looking in the field, or when we get it all done, I kind of have a couple how-to slides here on how we're going to go about doing it. Because this RAP data, Eric did a great job of showing you guys what the public website looks like, but all of that data is available for download. And what I like to say is call 1-800-GIS specialist, because I didn't certainly do this. I called our local fuels GIS specialist, and he's great, and he was able to download. I told him, I was like, I want it for both field offices. That'll cover the entire project area. There's Boise up here, so it'll cover the entire project area. And I told him I wanted it reclassified into these different buckets. And if your GIS specialist knows what he's doing, he should be able to do that pretty quickly. If not, I guess reach out, and our guy here in Boise is excellent, and was able to do it for us here on Bosch, Samantha down there in Burley, as well as Kelly in Nevada. So all this data, you can download it. You can it's the reclassify tool within ArcMap. I haven't used it, but I know that's how you do it. And then taking it a step further, once you have, your treatment area identified, you can use the extract by mask tool, and that'll just basically clip it to your treatment area and then do some calculations to figure out how much of each bucket, how many acres of each bucket that you have out there in your area. So, GIS will tell you you've got 4,100 acres out there. Here's our different cover buckets, and you essentially do a raster count. It's the count tool on your attribute table. So then you get a percent of raster after you add that up and divide those, and then multiply the percentage by the acres, and it'll spit out. So it's like, for instance, and this is an actual unit that we did last fall as Pheasants Forever on Bosch. I just did it, I didn't use the IDIQ, but this is how it would have looked. 1,322 acres with 0 to 1%. So on and so forth. But so that's how I see some of this working. Some of this applications, how it might work. How much is it going to cost to treat this much? I can't tell you how many times I've had that question asked me. Well, how much is it going to cost? It's like, you have a best guess, but now it's just like, let me run a number, and with a pretty high amount of certainty, I can tell you what it's going to cost. So I guess let me back up slightly. Once you have the acres, then you'll know the cost on each year. So I would really just add on one more column to this slide. And the only reason I haven't done that yet is because the IDIQ contract is out for bid right now. So here in a couple of weeks, I'll be able to figure out, what this year's stuff will be able to cost us. Which would be, answer that first question. How much is it going to cost? I'll know. We have X, if we have X number of dollars, is that going to be enough? We'll know. And I think just moving forward, being able to present like that we have this mechanism in place on a grant application, I feel like is going to strengthen the entire application, as well as just provide some certainty to us, at various times of the year when we're wondering, oh, do we have enough? Do we need to go look for more? Type of a deal. But it's still not going to be the end all do all. You get fires out in some of those areas. You have a dead tree, the RAP's not going to pick that up. And nor will it discriminate between a juniper, a mahogany, or a willow. So there's still going to be instances where I say the old way, where we just put out a unit and get a bid on it. That's still not going to go away. And you're still going to have to deal with the contractor, who's probably going to want to get paid at the higher level of difficulty. But at least you have, a defendable baseline of saying like, well, prove it to me that it's not this, what the RAP says essentially. So that's kind of my deep dive into how I'm using it for juniper removal. You've already seen this graphic for annual grasses, transitioning into that a little bit. The cheatgrass challenge. So a lot of these systems in Idaho are just reaching, and across the West really, are just reaching a threshold. And it leaves you oftentimes feeling a little overwhelmed and just where do we even start? And I think the cheatgrass challenge has done a good job of providing a framework for that. If it doesn't make sense, if there's other little projects, you can start with some partner funds, to maybe get ahead of the game of a cheatgrass challenge proposal. We're doing that this year, starting out with some partner funds with the intention of doing a cheatgrass challenge proposal in the future. But a lot of it, this framework on like, well, let's expand this core. That's great. It's a good way to think about things, but at the end of the day, you're still going to have willing landowners and systems that have flexibility and be able to pay for it. So taking this but this is an actual unit that the BLM cut last year within Bosch. There's the wrap run on it. Trees, 2.4%. And look at that long-term trend of annual grasses, like I mentioned at the start. That is a significant problem. But in my mind, it always makes sense to do conifer removal first where we can, because it just costs so much less to do. And back to the, from the very beginning of the conifer removal stories, it's like you're creating instant habitat, So yeah, good for us. Check that box that we solved the conifer removal problem. But in this area, the next thing you're going to want to turn the cannon of conservation towards is annual grasses. This was an adjacent, not quite in that same unit, but nearby. And you just look, and this would be a spot where you would think you'd just like throw in the towel, right? What can we possibly do here? This is a field of Medusa head. But again, back to that discussion of scale, that area is right here. And when you look at it on the larger landscape, it's like, yeah, you could see that this is part of kind of the leading edge of annual grass invasion. So working right there might be appropriate. You might spend additional time and dollars in reseeding as opposed to something else on the super edge of the fringe, but working in that area is still appropriate. And I really wanted to tie some of this stuff in to, not leave us feeling like, yeah, we can't ever solve the annual grass problem. You're going to have to do NEPA to get a project done. And what we're starting to see is the opportunity to tie in treatments into a grazing permit renewal that you have to do anyway. Because I don't know how other districts are, but here on Boise District, like Fuels, the group that I work out of, I mean, we're pedal to the metal all the time. And if you're going to have to do a NEPA document anyway, let's get some treatments in there. So then the field office can hand Fuels a ready to go deal. And I think just looking at how things are on the landscape, we've got to move more towards outcome-based solutions. If you go back and look at any of those areas, and it's like, well, the annual grass, that's not sustainable. The status quo really is not sustainable. What do we need to do to get these annual grasses under control? And that's the outcome that we want. How do we do it? And I just have one slide here on wilderness monitoring, how their BLM's using that. So this is the Bosch project area. In green here are these wilderness areas. And they're using, in these super remote areas, using the RAP data sets to actually, I just cherry picked the best looking graphic in the report. There was a ton of data in there, all based on RAP data sets. Like this one is, for instance, annual to perennial ratio. You can see there was a fire area here, happened in 2012, and you didn't see the flush of annuals until 2016. But just due to that system's resilience and annual grass to perennial grass ratio was pretty dadgum good before the fire, it was able, by 2019, is still looking pretty good. So that's kind of the slides that I had on RAP. I know that was probably a really quick run through. I'll stop sharing here. But
thanks, Connor. That was great.
Yeah,
that was a real great kind of just look at how, one area has been using RAP at kind of a local scale for numerous different projects, and then how just like the applicability, like Connor said, that RAP has for assisting kind of in the future with additional projects. So now if everybody wants to turn back on their cameras, that way everybody can kind of see each other's faces. We're going to have Eric and Connor, and we also have, like Eric said, we have Brady Allred, who joined us. And so Brady is a rangeland ecologist from the University of Montana. And like Eric said, kind of RAP was his brainchild. So this is a small group. We have some, really great people. You guys can pick their brain on some particulars. we do have some questions in the queue. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mariah to facilitate the questions. So Mariah, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Mandy. Alrighty. 1 second here. So I think our first question was from Tiffany, and I think I'll give you an opportunity to just ask your question yourself, but if you don't want to do that, I can read it. So Tiffany, would you like to ask your question for Eric?
Sure. Yeah, I was just wondering, sorry, I got to look at it again. That was a while ago, but basically about the production data and if it had been ground truthed at all and compared to ESDs or soil survey data. And yeah, if people had used it to see if it matches any production clippings like from a specific site.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, the answer is yes. So again, in that case, and yeah, I didn't cover that at all, or really any specifics in terms of kind of how we validate the models overall. But the manuscript and up on the RAP website itself, we have kind of those statistics and some plots showing RAP estimated production relative to clipped production from NRI plots. And so yes, that's all kind of available. I think, and yeah, Brady, would you add anything to that in terms of relating to ESDs or soil series, kind of site potential type stuff?
Which screen are you guys looking at right now?
I think we're on the right one. We've got the little plot and the products page.
Good. So yeah, thanks, Eric. So I pasted this into the chat, but as Eric said, yeah, we did compare it to on the ground data, nearly 16,000 on the ground plots collected through NRI, and that comparison is there on the website and in front of you now on the screen. And you know, as you can see, it's all over the place in some places, but it nails it pretty good overall. And so it does do a good job comparing to the on the ground data. We also have to keep in mind that the NRI data collection actually sometimes are just visual estimates and they don't actually clip and away either. We also compared it to what's called the Rangeland Production Monitoring Service, which is a very similar data set produced by the Forest Service. And also compared it to Surgo data, gridded Surgo data, which is the same data set that the ecological site descriptions and the soil survey use. And we have maps of the comparisons there as well as plot data. And so these three data sets, RAP, RPMS, and gridded Surgo are kind of the three broad scale data sets available for rangeland production. And unfortunately, Surgo is more of a static snapshot. It just kind of gives a high, medium, or low value, and so it doesn't tell you how things change through time. But we went ahead and compared them, and you know, the gist of it is they're all kind of getting at the same thing, and so they're all in relative agreement with one another. We can't treat any of these really as the gold standard, even NRI on the ground data collection. And so we just kind of look at relative comparisons and they do really well.
Awesome. Thanks for answering that question. Our next question, I think, is also for Eric, and that was from Ian. Would you like to ask your question? Ian, would you like to ask your question, or should we go to the next one?
I'm happy to ask it. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I just had that banner that goes across that says your internet connection is unstable, which is the worst banner you can get right before you get on a video call. So, and it's been great all day. So it's funny how that happens. Yeah, fairly straightforward question, I think. I was just curious how the annual precipitation data is derived. Is that a prism analysis, or what is the mechanism used to do that?
Yeah, so the input is similar to Prism. It's GridMet, which is from the University of Idaho. And so it's just a slightly finer resolution data set, but is essentially like GridMet, an interpolation of climate data that's available on a regular time period.
I'm not familiar with GridMet. Is that you said it's finer resolution, so you feel better about the results than a Prism analysis?
That's another good question for Brady on the technical details side. So Brady, I'm interested in how you thought about that.
Yeah,
selection.
to be honest, I can't remember if it's a finer resolution or not than Prism. So I think you might have to double check us on that one. But what it is, it's a very standard, and it's a newer product, but it's used a lot in a lot of different analyses and projects, and it's one that we feel very comfortable with. Now that said, if you compare it to your rain gauge at home or somewhere else, it will not be the same, right? None of these products will, and so these are interpolations, the different models and different algorithms, and they do use, you know, real rainfall data, but they try to fill in the gaps in between, and so just be aware.
Absolutely.
Great, thanks for that answer. Janine had a question next, also for Eric.
Hey Eric, yeah, so I was using the RAP
thanks
tool
for
the other day, and yeah, so I was just uploading the shapefile and playing around with stuff, and I noticed that my shapefile always disappeared when I went to the conservation tabs. I was just making sure that I wasn't using it incorrectly, or I think you're going to say that I need to download the data.
Oh no, no. So yeah, unfortunately, the different tabs don't share information. So you also aren't able to kind of like overlay exactly the vegetation cover with like the resilience and resistance data or something like that. So that's just a limitation in how the RAP is laid out. What you can do to overcome that, and you know, kind of getting into whether you would need to download the data or not. I think for like Connor's approach for downloading the data, that made perfect sense. But for a lot of instances, you don't want to have to download the data just to see how your polygon overlays on these different data sets. So for most of them, you can bring the web services into a GIS. And we have some documentation about how to bring the RAP data into your GIS. And I'm not sure with the supporting data sets, often you can find those layers as well. So then you know, at that point, you can have all the layers that you can click on and off for the different years and the different vegetation cover types, and have your shapefile nicely displayed there. So it's just kind of an idiosyncrasy of the RAP. And Brady, are there any plans to change that in any way? It's just kind of an inherent limitation of how it's laid out, isn't it?
Yeah, the vegetation tab is the only one that you can actually interact with and kind of do an analysis. The other ones are just there for visualization. There's no interaction, and so that's the reason you can't upload a shapefile. We do recognize, yes, it would be easier sometimes just to locate exactly, you know, what you're looking at, or to locate your project. But as Eric said, you have the ability to bring the data into GIS without downloading these massive data sets. And I put a link there in the chat box that explains how to do that. And also, Eric built out this support site that I encourage everyone to take a look at it. It has videos, it has screenshots, animations, how to do things. it's really, really well done. And so it's a fantastic, just new resource that we launched a few months ago, or a couple of weeks ago, maybe. And so it's a good resource to check out.
Awesome, thanks.
Great, thanks. Good question. So we've got a question from Mike in the chat. Mike, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
So my question is, when I've used this in the past and I wanted to kind of present the data as change over time in the years, I didn't really like having the roller coaster effect of my data as it's presented there. So I think I ended up using like a 3-year running average of the data in there to kind of smooth out some of the lines, to to tease out some of the the bigger trends. Is that an acceptable use of the data, I would ask?
I think it depends on what you're trying to depict. I was just thinking about that kind of earlier today. It depends to what extent you're interested in that annual variability, which can be important. These shrubland systems vary quite a bit, and it might even be somewhat surprising to see the shrubs bounce around a fair bit from year to year. These shrubs aren't just coming up one year and then disappearing. But if it's a drier year, or for whatever kind of local reason, maybe there is less vegetation on those shrubs, and the satellite's able to pick that up. And so, I think it's important just to, like you're already doing, I think, be thoughtful about whether it is appropriate. And then, it just kind of depends what you want to show. And sometimes it can be challenging to interpret those multi-year averages. So that's where I start to run into like, well, then we're all trying to think about this like multi-year smooth average, and is that like worth applying that, or should I just show the raw data? And so there are kind of a variety of different considerations that I would just think about, but I wouldn't categorically rule out doing that.
Well, I'll just give you a little bit more context too, and that was looking at conifer encroachment into our sagebrush steppe ecosystem. So I felt it was appropriate to kind of take out some of that roller coaster there to kind of get the bigger picture. And we're using this as one small piece of multiple lines of evidence. So that's where I thought was appropriate.
Yeah. And a lot of times, I think I showed that example from Southern Oregon, is kind of that same thing where it bounces around a little bit, but there's a general upward trend in that particular area as well. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Awesome. It looks like there is a question from Connor in the chat. Connor, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess just on some places it seems like, and I can even share my screen unless you guys know what I'm talking about, but share. All right. Like this is Twin Falls, Burley, Smith Works down there. But like up here, Craters of the Moon, where I was talking about, where I collected all that data for BLM way back in the day.
You should come see him for the call.
All these different.
You should come say hi to the people on the call. Will you let him jump up? Come here.
And Mike, I think you may not be muted. But all these different lines, just random swaths, it looks like. I'm not sure. Do you guys have any idea what that is?
Yeah, so that's an artifact. That particular one is an artifact of one of the Landsat satellites. So I mentioned that Landsat, there's kind of this whole, we could have another hour about Landsat, and probably longer if we wanted to. But there's one of the Landsat satellites that had an issue with its scanner, essentially. And so it doesn't pick up the peripheries of each image. And so you end up with that particular sensor with, kind of these gaps between where otherwise the different collections would overlap much more perfectly. And so, yeah, it's just kind of an artifact. And you know, it's the kind of thing that frustrates all of us too. And it's kind of just one of the necessary aspects of it. One way I like to think about it is like, you know, we could throw out Landsat 7 maybe and show, you know, we'd get a smoother image perhaps, but that Landsat 7 is still for those areas collecting valuable information. And so, you know, it becomes a challenge to interpret at some point across those lines. And so I think at that point, you know, it's a good chance to take a step back and to think about the fact that there is error inherent in these measurements. And so to not be too, you know, precise in how we're interpreting them. And so yeah, but that's why that's there. And you'll occasionally see other artifacts in the data that are kind of similar to that.
Yeah, I figured it was a satellite deal. Thanks.
Yep.
Awesome. You guys are asking such great questions. We have time for probably one or two more. So if anyone else has a question, go ahead and unmute yourself and just ask a question. No more questions. You can also type it in the chat if you want. Well, I have a question. So I think you guys have a ton of really great resources on your website. So my question is sort of, what should someone do if you're working on a project with RAP, or if you want to try to get your partners to use RAP, you think it's really great, it fits in with the work they're doing, like what would be some of those resources? Who should we contact? Like what's our number one sort of go-to for all of those questions?
Yeah, so, you know, getting started, we've tried to build out the help site in a way that people can go right there. And, you know, whether you're somebody who's familiar that just wants to clarify something, or whether you're brand new, you're kind of directed to where, you know, you can get the information you need that would be helpful. We have also a YouTube channel where you can watch various presentations that we've given at SRM or elsewhere. So those are both useful for getting a handle on it. And I also just want to say that, Connor, I thought that was a really interesting presentation, and I really loved the way that you were thinking about RAP in the context of all of the complexities of implementing management on the ground. And so, you know, using each other as resources, I would think would be really helpful, because, you know, oftentimes, like, I feel like I'm coming from this abstracted place of, you know, producing and working with data and thinking about data in the context of these complex resource issues that you're ultimately tasked with dealing with. You all can be great resources as you're kind of striking out down this path wherever each of you are. Brady, did I miss anything on that? Is there any best first place?
No, please reach out to Eric, to myself, to each other, and we're happy to answer any questions, to point people in any directions, and to give presentations, or even, you know, have further discussions like these. And I also agree with Eric. Connor, that was a fantastic demonstration of RAP in action. So thank you very much.
Yeah, we will often like jump on calls where we're trying to work out, well, is it appropriate to use RAP in this context? And I mean, we have such a kind of big team that we can pull in specialists on all these different issues to work through that. So yeah, please, like I said, this is a first go kind of at creating kind of a common understanding with RAP, and hopefully like we can keep this conversation going and just you know, think of us as a resource that can help you using RAP.